Listen, I need to tell you about the time the entire global economy nearly collapsed because rich people got way too excited about bird shit. And I'm not being metaphorical here. I'm talking about actual, literal, sun-baked seabird excrement that somehow became more valuable than gold and almost triggered World War I before World War I was even a thing. This is the story of guano. And if you think you can't make a financial thriller out of fossilized pelican crap, you're dead wrong. Picture this. It's the 1840s, and Europe has a problem. They've been farming the same land for centuries, and the soil is completely exhausted. Crop yields are collapsing. People are starving. Ireland's potato famine? That wasn't just about potatoes, it was about soil that had been worked to death. Britain is looking at its failing wheat fields thinking, we're screwed. France is nervous. Germany's freaking out. Everyone's trying to figure out how to feed their exploding populations without, mass starvation and revolution. Enter a Prussian guy named Alexander von Humboldt. He's been traveling around South America like some kind of 19th century science influencer, and he comes back with stories about these islands off the coast of Peru that are covered in bird shit, so thick, so nitrogen rich, so absolutely perfect for fertilizer that it's basically agricultural cocaine. We're talking deposits 200 feet deep in some places. 200 feet. That's a 20-story building made entirely of bird feces that's been accumulating for thousands of years because it never rains there. The Chincha Islands were essentially mountains of compressed seabird waste, and to starving Europe, they looked like Mount Olympus. The Peruvians had known about guano forever. The Incas used it, they controlled it, they even had a death penalty for anyone who disturbed the birds during breeding season. But they were using it locally, sustainably, like a normal renewable resource. Then the Europeans showed up with their ships and their capitalism, and their complete inability to not turn everything into a speculative bubble, and they looked at those islands and saw dollar signs, or pound signs, or whatever currency they were destroying that week. Here's where it gets insane. A single island, Chincha Norte, had an estimated 20 million tons of guano. 20 million tons. Ship captains started describing the smell from miles away. They said it burned your eyes, made you vomit, and you could taste it in your food. The ammonia fumes were so strong they'd corrode the copper on ships' hulls, but nobody cared because this stuff worked miracles. You spread it on dead soil and suddenly you're getting crop yields that are 50, 60, 70% higher. It was literal magic for farmers, and Europe went absolutely berserk for it. By the 1850s, guano fever had completely infected the global economy. The price per ton went from basically nothing to more than what most workers made in a year. Peru, which had been a relatively poor Spanish colony, suddenly controlled the most valuable natural resource on Earth that wasn't gold. The government in Lima started giving away exclusive export contracts to their friends, who became millionaires overnight. British trading houses were fighting each other for guano contracts like it was the spice trade all over again. American ships were racing to Peru, loading up with bird shit and selling it for obscene markups. Fortunes were made in months. Entire banking dynasties were built on seabird waste. And here's the thing that makes this truly insane: the working conditions. Because somebody had to actually dig up all this bird shit and load it onto ships, and that job fell to Chinese laborers who were essentially enslaved. The Peruvian government and their business partners recruited over 100,000 Chinese workers with promises of fair wages and good conditions, which was a complete lie. These men were worked to death on islands that were literal hell. The temperature was over 100 degrees. The ammonia fumes caused respiratory damage, blindness, and chemical burns. The guano dust got in their lungs and never came out. They were given minimal food, beaten by overseers, and paid almost nothing. Suicide was so common that workers were locked up at night to prevent them from jumping off cliffs into the ocean. We're talking about thousands of deaths. Nobody in Europe cared because they were too busy watching their wheat grow. The money was so good that Peru's entire economy became dependent on guano. By 1860, guano exports accounted for nearly 80% of Peru's government revenue. 80%. The country wasn't building anything else, wasn't investing in industry or infrastructure, just selling bird shit as fast as they could dig it up. Classic resource curse. The politicians in Lima were spending money like drunk sailors, funding a war with Spain, buying weapons, building ornate government buildings, and generally acting like the guano would last forever. Spoiler alert, it didn't last forever. But before we get to the collapse, it gets weirder. Because America looked at Peru getting filthy rich off guano and thought, we want some of that. The problem was, the best guano deposits were already claimed. So in 1856, the U.S. Congress passed something called the Guano Islands Act, which is possibly the strangest law ever written. It said that any American citizen could claim any uninhabited island covered in guano deposits anywhere in the world, and that island would become U.S. territory. Just like that. Find an island with bird shit on it, plant a flag, and congratulations, you just expanded America. This led to the most ridiculous land grab in history. American entrepreneurs were sailing around the Pacific and Caribbean with maps and shovels, looking for any rock that had seabirds on it. At one point, the United States claimed nearly 100 islands under this act. Most of them were tiny, uninhabitable rocks that happened to have some dried bird poop on them. There were territorial disputes, near wars, and diplomatic incidents over islands that were literally just guano-covered rocks in the middle of nowhere. Britain and America almost went to war over a place called Navassa Island, which is basically a nightmare rock between Haiti and Jamaica that's covered in bird shit and venomous spiders. That's what the global economy had come to. Nuclear powers ready to fight over spider-infested bird poop islands. Meanwhile, back in Peru, the guano deposits were running out. By the 1870s, it was becoming clear that they'd been mining the stuff way faster than the birds could produce it. Those 20 million tons were gone. The mountains of bird shit that took thousands of years to accumulate had been strip mined in about 30 years. The Chinese workers had literally been worked to death to extract every last ounce of this stuff, and now it was running out. Peru's government panicked. Their entire economy was built on guano exports, and suddenly the guano was disappearing. So they did what every rational government does when their unsustainable resource boom is collapsing. They took out massive loans from European banks using future guano sales as collateral. This is the selling air phase of every commodity bubble. They borrowed millions of pounds from British banks, promising they'd pay it back with guano money that they definitely weren't going to have. The banks, for reasons that defy sanity, actually gave them the money. Then things got really stupid. Peru decided to invade the one place that still had decent guano deposits, islands controlled by Bolivia. This triggered the War of the Pacific in 1879, which was basically a war fought over who got to control the remaining bird shit. Chile joined in because they also wanted the guano and the nitrate deposits in the same region. This wasn't some small border skirmish. This was a full-scale war with naval battles, thousands of casualties, and Chile eventually conquering huge chunks of Bolivia and Peru. The war devastated Peru's economy. They'd borrowed all this money they couldn't pay back, lost the war, lost most of their remaining guano deposits to Chile, and suddenly found themselves in a debt crisis that would make modern Greece look well-managed. British bondholders were furious. There was talk of Britain actually invading Peru to seize assets. The Peruvian government was forced to hand over their railroads, their land, and basically their economic sovereignty to foreign creditors. The guano boom had turned into a complete catastrophe. But here's the darkest irony. By the time Peru's economy was collapsing, Europe didn't even need guano anymore. Because while all of this was happening, a couple of German chemists figured out how to synthesize ammonia from atmospheric nitrogen. The Haber-Bosch process, invented in the early 1900s, meant you could make fertilizer in a factory instead of scraping it off rocks in the Pacific. The entire guano industry, all the suffering, all the wars, all the economic mania became obsolete almost overnight. The miracle fertilizer that was supposed to save civilization was replaced by industrial chemistry, and suddenly those islands full of bird shit were worthless again. Now, you might think this is where the story ends, but it gets even darker, because the Haber-Bosch process that replaced guano, it didn't just make fertilizer, it made explosives. The same process that was supposed to feed the world also enabled industrial warfare on a scale never seen before. World War I, World War II, every modern conflict, they're all possible because we figured out how to synthesize nitrogen. The technology that made guano obsolete is the same technology that gave us chemical weapons, carpet bombing, and the ability to kill millions of people efficiently. So, in a weird way, the guano bubble collapsing might have actually made things worse. Let's talk about what happened to all those people who got rich off guano. Most of them lost everything in the collapse or moved on to the next speculative bubble. The trading houses shifted to rubber, then oil, then whatever else they could monopolize. The Chinese workers who survived were abandoned on those islands or scattered across South America with nothing. Peru spent decades trying to recover from the debt crisis. The environment on those islands was completely destroyed, with bird populations decimated and ecosystems wrecked. And the politicians and financiers who caused the whole mess, most of them faced zero consequences. They just moved on to the next scheme. The crazy thing is, we didn't learn anything from this. The guano bubble had every element of a modern financial crisis: unsustainable resource extraction, speculative mania, predatory lending, government corruption, environmental destruction, and a complete collapse that destroyed lives while the people responsible walked away rich. It's the same pattern we've seen with tulips, with railways, with dot-com stocks, with housing bubbles, with crypto. We keep doing this over and over again, just with different commodities. And guano isn't even completely gone from the market. There's still a small trade in it today, mostly for organic farming, and it still comes primarily from islands off Peru. But now it's a niche product instead of a global obsession. The Chincha Islands are protected now, and the birds are slowly recovering, though the populations will never be what they were before Europeans showed up with ships and greed. Here's what makes this story so perfectly absurd. For about 30 years in the mid-1800s, the global economy was dependent on bird shit. Governments rose and fell because of it. Wars were fought over it. Thousands of people died extracting it. Fortunes were made and lost, and then it was over, replaced by chemistry and industrial processes, and everyone just moved on to the next thing to exploit. The guano bubble proves something important about human nature and capitalism. We'll create a speculative mania out of literally anything if there's money to be made. It doesn't matter if it's tulips or tech stocks or seabird excrement. If you can convince enough people that something is valuable, it becomes valuable until suddenly it's not, and then everything collapses. The same financiers who were solemnly discussing guano futures in London were probably laughing about how stupid the tulip mania was. They didn't see that they were doing the exact same thing, just with a different ridiculous commodity. And the human cost? That's always where these stories get really dark. Because behind every commodity boom, there are workers being exploited, environments being destroyed, and communities being devastated. The Chinese laborers on those guano islands weren't thinking about agricultural chemistry or crop yields. They were just trying to survive another day in hell while rich men in Lima and London got richer off their suffering. That's the part that never changes. The commodity changes, the technology changes, but there's always someone at the bottom getting crushed by the machine while everyone else profits. So the next time you see a speculative bubble forming, whether it's NFTs or some new cryptocurrency or whatever the current mania is, remember the guano bubble. Remember that humans once went completely insane over bird poop, built entire economies on it, fought wars over it, and then watched it all collapse when something better came along. We're not as rational as we think we are. We're not as different from our ancestors as we'd like to believe. We're still capable of convincing ourselves that the most ridiculous things are valuable, and we're still capable of ignoring the suffering we cause in pursuit of profit. The Great Guano Bubble is a perfect encapsulation of everything absurd about capitalism, colonialism, and human nature. It's a story about how we'll commodify anything, exploit anyone, and destroy any environment if there's money in it. It's about how governments and businesses will collaborate to create unsustainable booms that benefit a few people while devastating everyone else. And it's about how we never really learn from these disasters, because the people making the decisions never face the consequences. Peru's guano era lasted about 30 years and nearly destroyed the country. The environmental damage lasted generations. The human suffering is incalculable. And what do we have to show for it? Some slightly better crop yields in Europe for a few decades before synthetic fertilizer made the whole thing obsolete anyway. That's it. That's the legacy of the guano bubble. 30 years of insanity, exploitation, war, and environmental destruction, all for a temporary bump in agricultural productivity that we could have achieved anyway through less insane means. The world almost ended because of bird shit. Not metaphorically, actually. We almost had a global war over guano. We destroyed ecosystems and killed thousands of workers over it. And we built economic systems that collapsed spectacularly when the supply ran out. And somehow, incredibly, we're still doing the same thing today with different resources. We're still building unsustainable booms, still exploiting workers, still ignoring environmental costs, still acting like this time it's different and the bubble won't burst. It always bursts. Ask Peru. Ask the Chinese workers who died on those islands. Ask the British bondholders who lost their investments. Ask the Bolivian government that lost its coastline in a war over bird poop. The bubble always bursts, and the people who pay the price are never the ones who profited from the boom. That's the real lesson of the guano bubble, and it's a lesson we still haven't learned after nearly 2 centuries. We probably never will. There's always another commodity to speculate on, another resource to exploit, another group of workers to sacrifice, another bubble to inflate. And there will always be people willing to convince themselves that this time is different, that this boom is sustainable, that the bird shit mountains will never run out. Until they do, and then everyone acts surprised when it all falls apart, and we start the whole cycle over again with something new. That's the story of guano. That's the story of how bird shit nearly ended the world. And if you think it couldn't happen again, you haven't been paying attention.